Thank you, Madam President. And I rise for a few comments on Mr. Giles and his renomination to the Board of Pardon and Paroles. I stand today in support of the victims' families. Victims' families that have been re-victimized by the policy that has been enacted by the chairman, Mr. Giles. It appears after testimony, he is the one who has crafted this policy for the Board of Pardon and Paroles. This policy was crafted in the darkness of COVID. And before COVID, you may have heard that the previous 6 years, we had 5 commutations. Since this policy was enacted, we now have close to 71. 44 of them are serious, violent offenders. I think today in this circle, we have a very serious decision to make. Does the Board of Pardon and Paroles and the chairman fit the mission that the state of Connecticut wants to proceed with? Are we a body that wants to stand with victims and their families, or are we a body that thinks it's okay to have sentences overturned by a lay person's board? These are people that are changing the decision of sentencing judges, of juries, of plea deals. Why do we even have people make plea deals? Why do we have sentencing judges spending hours and deliberating over what the appropriate sentence is for the crime if they are in turn, after 10 years, allowed to just come in front of a layperson's board that creates their own policy in the darkness of night that the governor's office doesn't know about, the Judiciary Committee doesn't know about, none of us know about, and change the trajectory of our judicial system in the state of Connecticut? I say this has to change. This is a stain on us as Connecticut, and this is wrong. And I'm going to go through some of the actions that this Board of Pardon and Paroles has taken. But before I do that, I want you to know that I'm standing here today for Elizabeth Carlson, and her mother is right up here. Elizabeth Carlson was a young woman with a bright future who happened to fall in love with the wrong guy, who became obsessive and stalking. And when Elizabeth moved home with her parents and said, I need to separate myself from this man who is a highly educated, highly functioning, older adult, he snuck into her house. He was hiding in her bedroom. And when she came into her bedroom, she saw him and screamed to her sister downstairs. He shut the door, he barricaded it, and he shot her 7 times point blank against the door. When her sister tried to open the door, her sister's body kept the door shut. Then he tried to kill her sister. As her sister ran out of the house and down the street, he was coming out with his gun with hundreds and hundreds of rounds of ammunition to kill their entire family. Luckily for Leslie, a neighbor was outside who called 911 and the police came. This was 2002. This wasn't that long ago. And her family went through something that many of us in the circle could never even comprehend. When she reached out to me about this policy, which is how I found out, which is how our Senate found out, which is how the Judiciary Chair found out. Ranking member found out. And told us the story that this man, who was sent away for 42 years on a plea deal, an ironclad contract that was negotiated over a year between the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the families, and the re-victimization of what this family had to go through, he was signing up for a pre-screening for a commutation hearing because he was a good boy during COVID and he gave shots. He happened to be a veterinarian, so he could give a shot. The fact that this family is given 5 days to get all of that unpacked and to rally people to try to say, do not let him out, do not let his sentence be commuted. And sometimes they can't get a hold of the family in 5 days, right? 5 days is not a lot of time to unpack that trial and that trauma. So she reached out to me on the behalf of victims, and they have an army of them, and they are watching what we do here today. Stand with the victims and stop this policy from continuing. This policy allows someone like the man who killed Elizabeth to come back every 3 years. So the Carlsons have already been given a life sentence. They've lost their daughter. Their other daughter is still traumatized by seeing her dead sister. Their best friends are traumatized. Mr. Carlson can't even say the person's name. He speaks to him as his inmate number. They have been through therapy, grief counseling, and their mission now is to make sure that no other family has to be re-victimized and re-traumatized every 3 years. That's what happens in this particular policy. I also want to remind you of one of our fellow colleagues, Mr. Delacruz, Representative Delacruz. His stepson was murdered in a shooting right in my town, in Groton. Again, there was a trial. That person was sentenced to a very long time. But according to this policy, he can sign up at 10 years to have his sentence commuted. And that is just wrong. It's wrong for the families. It's wrong for the victims of the families. It's wrong for the person who's no longer with us. There's nothing worse than taking someone's life. This is not embezzlement. This is not, fraudulent activity in business. This is taking someone's life. There's a totally different level of crime here. So I'm going to go through what the Board of Pardon and Paroles has done over the last year to give you some highlights of some of the people that we have commuted sentences so we can get a flavor for what's happening. And I couldn't agree more with my colleagues as to this Board of Pardon and Paroles needs to carry out the mission of the citizens of the state of Connecticut. It cannot be this autonomous board that decides what they want, when they want, depending on who the chairman is. I want to applaud the governor for asking Mr. Giles to no longer be the chair, but he's still, if he confirmed today, he's still going to be on this board. And I think that's a huge mistake. You don't just change the direction of the ship by taking the captain and putting him someplace else. We're just shuffling the deck here. And if we're going to do the right thing and set the tone for the state of Connecticut, there has to be an open process where every legislator has input, where the victims have input, for the prosecutors and the defense attorneys have input on what this policy should be. We're the ones representing the people of the state of Connecticut, not the Board of Pardon and Paroles. We need to collectively decide what that policy is, what is fair, what is just, and what is right. So let's talk a little bit about what the Board of Pardon and Paroles has done over the last year. Sean Jeffries. Sean Jeffries was killed by a convicted murderer. He fled the scene and was arrested Sean Jeffries is the victim. The murderer left the scene, fled, was convicted. He was sentenced to 45 years in jail, and his sentence was commuted by 20 years. Then in Thompson, Connecticut, we have Kenneth Bugby, who was also murdered outside the Thompson Elementary School. His convicted killer was sentenced to an unknown amount of time, which usually means an extremely long sentence. His sentence was commuted by 25 years. Armando Rivera, who was a grocer, he was shot with a shotgun because the perpetrator believed that Mr. Rivera was having an affair with his wife after the perpetrator consulted a Ouija board. He was originally sentenced to 55 years, and his sentence was commuted by 14 years by our Board of Pardon and Paroles. Jay Murray, these are Hartford folks. Jay Murray was killed in a drug deal that was gone bad. The perpetrator's sentence was 60 years in prison. They commuted his sentence by 19 years. So half of his sentence was shaved off by the Board of Pardon and Paroles. Again, in Hartford, Reggie Lee was stabbed in Hartford over a $10 debt. The convicted murderer was sentenced to 55 years in prison. Our Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted his sentence by 28 years. Again, Hartford. Omar Irving was killed near a playground in 1997. He was young, 24 years old. His convicted murderer was sentenced to 45 years, and our Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted 20 years off his sentence. Hartford again. Scott Houle was killed in an apparent drug deal. His convicted murderer was sentenced to 55 years. They commuted 19 years off his sentence. I'm going to go to Waterbury. Alana Gaiman was shot with a shotgun to the back of the head. And this person his perpetrator was convicted by DNA evidence and eyewitness accounts. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison, and our Board of Paroles commuted his sentence by 35 years, so shaving more than half his sentence. I want to also add that the people that I'm listing here, and I'm not going to list them all, they have tried every way to shorten their sentence. They've gone in front of sentencing judges to relook at their sentence. They've been denied. They've appealed. They've been denied. So what do when all those efforts fail? Well, let's go to the Board of Pardon and Paroles, because we'll definitely have our sentence commuted then. And that's what you're going to see repeatedly over and over. Again, Waterbury. This person, I'm going to actually say the perpetrator's name. This is Brian Lindo. He killed the mother of his children. He was convicted to 45 years. He admitted to doing it. And we commuted his sentence by 20 years. Let's go to Bridgeport now. Bridgeport, Aldridge Mitchell of Bridgeport. They tried to kidnap him, and when that went bad, they shot and killed him. His original perpetrator sentence was 45 years, and the Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted his sentence by 20 years. Are you seeing a pattern here? 20 years, 30 years. We're all getting to that magic number where it's clear that this Board of Pardon and Paroles feels that one person who has committed these types of crimes should not spend a day more, because we're all coming down to about the same number. That is a decision that should be made here in the legislative body, not by a lay board. Again, Bridgeport, Norman Jones in Bridgeport got in the middle of a gang dispute and was shot. His perpetrator was sentenced to 60 years. They commuted 40 years off his sentence. Bridgeport again. Marikath Strong was 16 years old when a series of disputes between this person and the perpetrator happened. They were murdered. The sentence was 43 years, and our Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted their sentence by 16 years. Daniel Moore was outside his home when he fell, and his attacker continued to shoot him even when he was on the ground. His attacker was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 85 years in prison, 30 without parole, and our Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted his sentence by 63 years. Mr. Bruce from Bridgeport was killed when he was at a nightclub, wrong place, wrong time. His perpetrator was sentenced to 60 years, and our Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted 35 years off his sentence. Now I'm going to go to New Britain. Tom Sodowski was shot in the face and set on fire on Christmas Eve, following a sexual encounter that didn't go well. His perpetrator was sentenced to 70 years in prison, but our Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted 44 years off of his sentence. In New Haven, a little 13-year-old girl, Miss Cole, happened to be the victim of a drive-by shooting. She was murdered, an innocent bystander caught in the middle of something horrible. The perpetrator was caught, the convicted killer was sentenced to 40 years, and they commuted 20 years off his sentence. So imagine having a 13-year-old daughter, a beloved child, that someone murders, you will never see her again, you will never get to see her grow up, and yet the murderer spends 20 years in prison. That's it. Michael Cox, we heard a lot about the Board of Pardon and Paroles and that nobody reoffends, but here is a story of someone who did reoffend. Michael Cox killed 2 people in New Haven and injured another during a crime. He was arrested and pled guilty. His original sentence was 75 years. The Board of Pardon and Paroles commuted his sentence by 30 years, which made him eligible for parole. After being on parole, and I actually read the transcript, which said he posed no risk because of his health condition. Upon being released on parole, 7 months later, he strangled his girlfriend and was arrested for that. And the Board of Pardon and Paroles pressured the police department to not arrest him, but to send him to a domestic violence diversionary program. Has anybody heard of anything more unbelievable than that? You murder 3 people, you strangle your girlfriend, and we want to send you to group therapy at a diversionary program in the state of Connecticut after commuting 30 years from your sentence. Lasheba Pouncey was stabbed to death in front of her 2-year-old daughter. Her assailant was given 48 years in prison, and again, we commuted his sentence. Andrew Paisley and Hurry Poole were killed during a shooting, and another person was wounded during an altercation outside of a diner in New Haven. The perpetrator was caught, sentenced. The original sentence, and this is an important one, was 100 years. We commuted this to 42 years. So 58 years we've taken off that person's sentence. A lay board. Dennis Carr was killed in New Haven. His perpetrator ran to Massachusetts, had to be apprehended. The FBI was involved. His original sentence was 50 years, and we commuted 20 years off of his sentence. Again, New Haven, an 80-year-old Joseph Licari was murdered. He was working with a friend when he was murdered. The original sentence was 65 years. We commuted 10 years off of that person's sentence. And it's important that we go through these. For senators that are here, you can hear what's happened in your particular district. Again, this is New Haven. Kenneth Hauser was killed outside of a nightclub in New Haven. He was a purported drug dealer. The perpetrator fled. He went to New York. There was all this police across state lines to bring him back. He was convicted and sentenced to 60 years, and we commuted his sentence by 20 years here. And in Norwalk, we have Edgar Sanchez, who was murdered. His perpetrator was sentenced to 45 years because he also had an illegal handgun at the time. We commuted his sentence by 20 years. In Stamford, we had Edgar Gordon, who was killed, and he was shot 5 times in the back, including firing 2 shots into Gordon after he was actually already dead. The convicted murderer was sentenced to 50 years, and we commuted 20 years off of his sentence. I give you those as highlights. Those are just a few. There's 71 of them that we did last year. So my question in all this is, where were the victims' families? Where was the opportunity for us as a legislature to say this is the right thing to do? This is the mission of the state of Connecticut, that we want to override what judges that spend years and years on the bench decide is the appropriate punishment, because there is punishment with crimes. And I do believe that people can be rehabilitated and have new turns on life. But when you take someone's life, or when you torture someone and kidnap them, and there's a plea deal that's an ironclad contract, how do we turn our face against that and give our power to a board of lay people that have no job description? There is no qualification to be on this board. It just happens to be if you're connected and you know the right people, you can sit on the board. And by the way, the chairman and other people are paid to be on this board. So we are paying people to be on the board of pardon and paroles that are releasing convicted, dangerous criminals. They are commuting decades off of sentences. And as you can hear from the list that I've given you, and there's more, and I'm sure you don't want to hear the rest of them, people think of commutations as a humanitarian act. I have done something wrong. I have been in jail. I have paid my time. I have paid for my I have dealt with the punishment that has been given to me because of what I have done. And perhaps my sentence may be commuted because I'm sick. I've served 99% of my sentence, and I'm released for humanitarian reasons. They are not thinking that we are shaving decades off of people's sentences. They're just not thinking that. And when the public hears this, they are outraged. I cannot tell you how many people are watching today how this vote goes. As I said, Audrey Carlson has an army of victims, families, and they have friends. And it is so important that we set the tone. I could never support this nominee to be on the member of the Board of Pardon and Paroles, not as chair and not as a member. You can't just take, the head of the ship and put him in the back and think that things are going to change. I don't think personally that we should be putting anybody on the Board of Paroles until we see that the policy has changed, until we have an open conversation with all parties having input on what we want here in the state of Connecticut to move forward. The governor has promised that, and I hope that we all hold him to that promise. So I think that there's no reason why we can't put these nominees to the side until that conversation has had an opportunity to happen. So I'm going to leave you with this. 2 years ago, I was able to sit on a trial of a triple homicide in my district, which was one of the most intense and uncomfortable and emotional experiences that I have had. The living survivors, one actually works for OPM here in the state of Connecticut, and the other one lives in district. This was a case where someone had been released early from prison, and they had a co-conspirator who was a young woman, and they were going to buy drugs in Griswold, Connecticut, and exchanging them for guns. But when they got there, they didn't have any drugs, and the person couldn't get into the gun locker. So what they did was they decided to just murder Matthew Lindquist, and they stabbed him 21 times and left him in the woods. Then they found their way to the parents' house, and they took a baseball bat and they killed the father with a baseball bat downstairs and the dog, and then went upstairs and tortured and used the baseball bat and strangled the mother. Then they set the house on fire. The young woman who was involved in that particular murder entered into a plea deal. She was going away for 40 years because she was going to testify against the man who was part of this tragedy. And I distinctly remember the judge saying, "You were going to go away for 40 years. This is a plea deal. You understand that this is a contract that you are entering into. You will spend not one day more, not one day less in jail. And you agree to this. And you will be able to see your children when you get out of jail. You'll be 60, but you'll be able to get out of jail and be able to see them." And she agreed. And the family had some type of solace that this woman was going to be away, that they had done the best they could, and there was a plea deal. Then they sat through the trial of the gentleman, Mr. Carrera, who was sentenced, I don't remember what the sentence was, it was a long time, for murdering 3 people. But the story is when that family left, they had not a feeling of peace, not a feeling of relief, but it was a time that they could build their lives back. They could start to function again, and they could try to put that tragedy in a box if they could, but they could start to move forward, because before that, they are stuck in this limbo and emotion of a trial, of what's going to happen, and it's torture for 3 years until it comes to trial, and there is some kind of closure, albeit not the closure you'd want, but there is some kind of closure. Now, can you imagine going through that? I can't imagine that, and I'm just a bystander sitting through that. Getting knock, a notice from the Board of Pardon and Paroles, a letter that you happen to maybe get on time that says, in 5 days, by the way, so-and-so is up for a commutation. So you have to unpack that trial, get all your friends together, get what you can to try to get in front of this board to say, no, it was a plea deal. Do not let this person have their sentence commuted. I don't think any of us here, unless we have experienced that, can comprehend the trauma, the stress, the anxiety, the fear of having to do that. And can you imagine having to do that every 3 years? This is insane. This is a horrible policy that has to be fixed. It's broken. Our system is broken if we allow this to go forward. The suffering that we are causing these families is immeasurable. Obviously, Ms. Carlson would much rather be doing something else than being up here today, but she is committed and she is not going to stop until what is right is done. So I have asked that all commutations be halted until this policy is fixed. And by fixed, I mean debated in the sunlight, not in the dark. And having input from judiciary, from regs review, from all of us, from victims, from the citizens of the state of Connecticut, because they are really, really horrified that this is going on. I can't tell you how bad the reception of this information has been to the general public. So I urge you, if you had somebody that you heard had their sentence commuted in your district, if you want to see the right thing be done in the state of Connecticut and have an opportunity for us to craft a policy that works for all of us, including the victims, send a message, vote no today. And I stand with that. I think it's important, and I am absolutely a no on this nomination today. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Summers.